Alright boys, welcome back to another tier list. This time we will be tiering draft league roles and how good they are, if you need them, all that fun stuff. Shout out to Bin, aka General Tar Heel, close friend of mine and the head coach of Play More for this past season in the GBA, for making this tier list and asking me to do it. Of course, I told him I would do it. I didn't know when. It's now. We've got some cool tiers here. We've got top tier. We've got great to have. We've got necessary, nice to have, but not needed. We got some cool little stuff on the screen that we're going to tier. We're going to go through and we're going to give all these bad boys a ranking. The first one that I want to talk about is going to be bulky water. That is top tier. That is necessary. Water is one of, if not the best defensive typing. In my opinion, it's first or second. It's right there with steel. I'm not gonna get into the debate. Bulky water is top 2, if not top 1 defensive typing in draft. It's one of the few types to resist ice. They're just generally a great check to a lot of things. Water is one of the best defensive typings, not just because it resists ice, but because in general it has so many resistances and only weak to 2 things, in grass and electric. You really do want a bulky water on your team, and if your team does not have a bulky water, in my mind that is one of the first things that I look at and look for, and I'm gonna deduct points from your draft in my mind if you do not have a bulky water. Something that I do think is unnecessary that everybody hypes up if they're like new to draft or they're watching old videos or they're just coming back is going to be the fire, water, grass core. While water, we just talked about a premier type, very needed. Fire and grass types you almost never really need. Fire types are cool to be a fairy resist in modern Pokemon, I guess. This is all specifically Paldea decks, by the way. Like, I drafted Volcarona to be my fairy resist in WPF and it worked well, but you kind of have to be aware of your surroundings. I had a steel type that was not resistant to fairy, and I knew the Volcarona could beat the certain matchups I had with like Enamorus and stuff like that. So not needed at all. And a lot of times I don't even have a fire type on my team. Grass types are cool, they're ground resist, but with the amount of levitate users and flyers, you don't really need it. It's cool, it's nice to have sometimes depending on your build, but fire types and grass types are not necessary at all. Speaking of not necessary, we have electric. I assume fast electric was the idea behind this one. It's not necessary, they're nice, however they are not needed. They are kind of thought to be a little needed just because of the fact that they have these elite speed tiers and they're so fast, but those are fillable with other Pokemon. You don't necessarily need to be an electric type to fill that role, and then there are a lot of other great ways to break waters in modern Pokemon, so there's really not a need to draft a fast electric type, and that shouldn't be one of your checkboxes going into a draft. Next up is going to be Wish Passer. I really want to talk about this one because I have, Wish on my current GBU team, but I don't think it's necessary by any means. It is nice to have, but it depends on the build of Pokemon that you have. Like, my GBU team is extremely bulky and it plays like that, and it really enjoys a good Wish Pass into certain Pokemon. Same thing with my WPF team. Like, good bulky offensive players or good balanced players will really find that Wish is going to be super valuable. However, it is not needed on every team by any means. If you bring Wish on a hyper offensive team, it's really not going to be broad and really shouldn't be used a whole lot. There are certain niche scenarios, never say never, obviously, but more times than not, Wish is going to be mainly for those balanced and bulky offensive teams. Ooh, here we go. Regenerator. It's nice to have, but not needed. You definitely do not need a Regenerator Pokemon. There are so many teams that do not have Regenerator Pokemon. There's, what, 5 Regenerator Pokemon in the decks right now, I think? Oh, I guess 7 because Slowbro and Slowking have 2 forms, right? There might be more, but that's what I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Every team cannot have a Regenerator Pokemon, so it's impossible to say that this is necessary. And while it is the best ability in the game, probably, at least in singles, it's not something you should be going in and saying, yes, I need a Regenerator Pokemon or my team is garbage. We're going to switch necessary and great to have around because I feel like that makes a little bit more sense, because I think this is the second highest tier. Where did it go? Special Breaker as well as Physical Breakers. This is a PSA to everybody that's watching right now. Stall almost never works in draft. It takes a really good top end player to make stall work, and even then there's been very few players that I've seen make stall work. Shout out to Seansters if you're watching this, by the way. He's one of the few players that I know that can consistently make stall work. So especially in this deck, stall is not an option. Almost never is it an option. There's way too many good breakers, and every team needs at least 1 physical and 1 special breaker. In my mind, if you don't have that, your team gets really easy to prep for. If you have all physical breakers, your opponent could bring a Reflect. You're really susceptible to Willow. If you only have special breakers, there's AV and Light Screen. So really, I don't think there's too much I should have to explain about that. You really do need 1 of each at minimum. Weather and Terrain Setter, this is going to be another nice to have, not needed. There's certain niche teams, or even not niche this generation with how many Paradox Pokemon there are, that will really buy in the sun, or back in Gen 8 and 7, sand was all the rave and rain, and never really snow. Although snow's picked up a little bit this generation with Alola Ninetales, Chili Reception, Bax Caliber. It's nice to have, but never could you ever say the weather is necessary on a team. Ground immunity is necessary in my opinion. You need, I don't know, ground immunity slash resist. Is there a way I can edit that? Imagine it says ground immunity slash resist. You need some form of resist as far as Earthquake goes. There are very few successful teams that do not have an Earthquake resist, but Earthquake is such a free spammable zero downside move in almost every situation. You need a way to punish that. You just really want to have some sort of an immunity or a resist. You know, since it says just immunity, I'll put it in great to have, but realistically you need to have an immunity or a resist. Diverse speed tiers. I'm not arguing with you on this. This is necessary. I'm sick and tired of people saying it's not necessary and then drafting very poor speed tiers. That is a big pet peeve of mine. I really think you need at least a Pokemon around 115, a Pokemon around 100, and then a Pokemon around like 85, 80, and then the rest you can kind of do whatever you want. Do not have clumpy speed tiers. It makes it super hard to prep for you as an individual. If you have a 98, a 97, and like a 92 speed Pokemon, they're all going to be hitting the same speed, and it's going to be super annoying and clunky. It's not fun to prep with. I've done it before. That is one of my biggest pet peeves in draft, is non-diverse speed tiers. Get you a little bit of variance with your speed tiers, man. Trappers, nice to have, not necessary. I feel like that's not too crazy of a take. Setup Sweeper, I don't think it's necessary to have, but I do think it's great to have. If you're running like a more bulky or balanced build, you probably want it, but you don't necessarily need it. I don't know. It's weird. It's one of the things that I would almost put in necessary, but I don't think that it's the same level of needing a physical and special breaker, because even but most mons have set up in this deck, so I feel like it kind of goes hand in hand. It's very, very tough to separate that, but I'm gonna put it in great to have. Dual screens, top tier, baby. Let's run some screens. I'm just kidding. I like screens a lot, though. If you know me, you know I bring screens almost every week. They're great to have. I think it's impossible to put them any lower than that. I don't think they're necessarily needed, but I think that pretty much no matter what Pokemon you draft, you're gonna have some form of screens. So just keep that in the back of your mind that, hey, maybe if I set up screens for the setup sweeper in the back, I could win the game potentially. All right, we've got our third unnecessary here. I'm sick and tired of everybody saying you need Fairy Steel Dragon. Fairy and Steel, maybe. We'll talk about that one next, actually. But Dragon? No, you do not need a dragon. Defensively, they're fine, but most dragons are not defensive. There's like, Noivern's cool, but it's cool because it has an elite speed tier and gives you defog, not because it has a lot of resists. Haxorus is cool, but because it has a 97 speed tier and fills out that almost 100 speed tier and gives you a physical breaker as well as a setup sweeper. These Pokemon are not fitting on teams because they are dragon types. They're fitting on teams because they do so much other stuff. Fairy and Steel, we're also going to put that in top tier. Fairy less so than Steel. I think Steel is the #1 type in draft, if not Water. It's Water and Steel are 1 and 2, but then Fairy is probably #3, but I would almost not put it top tier. Nah, it's top tier. Fairy is so good, man. It stops dragon spam, which is super important to not let those dragons run wild. If your opponent does have a Haxorus or a Noivern, like I was talking about earlier, it lets them not run crazy, gives you some sort of an immunity, which is obviously really, really nice. And just defensively, it's just really, really nice to soak up so many different hits and only have 2 weaknesses. You resist like fighting, bug, you're a U-turn resist now, and you're only weak to steel and poison, which is really nice. You can cover that really easily with the steel type. So those two in conjunction with another, they fit very well together. I think Steel is more necessary, but Fairy is obviously very, very good. Disruptor's Taunt / Encore. I think it's great to have. Taunt and Encore, I'm a sucker for it. It lets you stop setup sweepers, which is really important, and it can, you know, sometimes be a win con, not letting a certain Pokemon set up. Okay, well, my Tornadus has Taunt, so you can't set up in my face and I live anyone hit. So I'm a big fan of that. Encore is also my favorite move in the game, so I'm a sucker for that. Just being able to stop setup in any sense and that make you not lose the game, I think is extremely valuable. It's definitely better than anything in nice to have. We'll change it to borderline necessary. If that's the case, we got to move dual screens down because dual screens is definitely not borderline necessary. Status abusers, I think, are nice to have, but not necessarily needed. This is like Conk to absorb Will-O-Wisp or Fire types to absorb Will-O-Wisp. I think it's definitely like a more niche situation where you absorb the status. Grounded Poison type, this in any other generation, I would put this necessary, but because boots exist, I'm going to put this in borderline necessary. You're not going to catch me very often with a draft that doesn't have a poison type, because I don't want to be forced into boots on a lot of different Pokemon, but there are people who believe differently than me. Because boots exist, you could put this as low, is nice to have, not needed, and I wouldn't be mad about it. But because I don't want to run boots on all 6 of my Pokemon every single week, I think it's borderline necessary because you want to absorb those T-spikes is the whole idea. While we're at it, we'll talk about hazard removal. I think hazard removal is still necessary. Just because boots exist does not mean that you can get by with no hazard removal. Hazard removal is still very, very crucial, especially in a meta where so many different things got access to spikes and stealth rocks and even T-spikes this generation. There's just so many hazards everywhere and there's a lack of removal, so getting good removal early is always a great option, in my opinion, just to make sure that your Pokemon that are weak to rocks do not have to run boosts every single week. And you know, there's exceptions to that, like Dragonite is most of the time going to run it anyway, Volcarona is going to run it most of the time anyway, but there's mons like Bundle where you really don't want to run boots, you want to get a remover with Bundle almost inevitably. I don't care what you say, Owen, I don't care about your boots, man, I think you need some removal. Fast spikes, nice to have, not needed. I think spikes of any capacity, oh, there's a spikes option. Okay, fast spikes is not needed. It's cool, it's nice to have fast spikes, I guess, so you guarantee get them up. Not needed by any means. Spikes, on the other hand, borderline necessary. I think hazards are such a good thing to have in this meta, and especially with limited removal, you either force boots and you know that they don't have an actual item that helps them in the situation in front of you, like you will know they have boots if you get those spikes up, or they'll take spikes damage. They'll take 12% every time they come in unless they're a levitator or a flyer, so very useful. I'm a big spikes guy, and I think in the same vein, stealth rocks are borderline necessary, if not necessary. We're gonna say they're necessary. A ghost, it's nice to have, but it's not needed for sure. Ghost, the whole idea is to spin block. That's kind of like the main thing. There's obviously other reasons to have a ghost, like Dragapult. You don't want to necessarily spin block with Dragapult, but it's really nice to offensively pressure your opponent, to be a fast pivot, and to have one of the best unresisted types in the game. It's cool, it's nice to have, but it's definitely not something that you need every draft. If you have hazard stack, you probably do want a ghost, but otherwise I wouldn't say it's needed. Elite speed, I think, depends on what your classification of elite speed is. If we're talking 120 plus, I think it's necessary. If we're talking like 150, like Electrode, anything past that, I think it is unnecessary. So there's a big jump here. I'm gonna put it in borderline necessary. If we're assuming 120 plus, I think it's almost needed, but I do think there are some teams that can get away with not necessarily having it, like having a best speed Pokemon 115. I wouldn't call 115 elite speed, right? I guess it really just depends on how you define elite speed. I'm going to define it as 120 plus, and I think you can get by with a base 115 highest speed Pokemon. Wall / unaware, I feel like these are two very different things. Walls in general are necessary, but unaware is simply not necessary. So because of that, I'm going to just interpret this as unaware wall, and I'm going to put in nice to have, not needed, because unaware walls are not needed. Just for complete transparency, if you did not skip this part of the video, if it is just meaning a wall, that is necessary. Yeah, you know what, we'll meet in the middle. We'll put it in borderline necessary because I'm not sure what it means, but if it means wall, it's necessary. If it means unaware wall, it's nice to have, not needed. Top tier ground, I don't think that's necessary at all. I almost think that's unnecessary. I think having a ground in general is nice. A top tier ground you do not need. I love drafting Sandaconda as my ground and getting away with it. Obviously, there's other situations where you do like grounds. I like Hippowdon. Like, you do not need top tier grounds to prevent Volt Switch. Any ground in general, ground types, necessary. Top tier ground, not necessary. And you know what? Ooh, that did not work. All right, this says ground and this says wall. I'm not redoing them. I think it's very funny. Knockoff users, the borderline necessary, but I wouldn't say necessary. Knocking off items is great, and it's good to have on like balanced teams, but not necessary at all. Strong priority, same thing. Borderline necessary. Revenging Pokemon is great, but it's not needed. It might even be nice to have, not needed, because I don't think it's borderline necessary at all. Just the fact that having it makes your games a lot easier, and depending on your builds, you're really gonna appreciate having or miss having strong priority. Dark is borderline necessary so you don't get setup spammed with stored power, but those sets are a lot less common now that Roost and Slack Off and all this stuff is only 8 PP, so it's not necessary anymore in my opinion, but it is borderline necessary. You almost always do want a Dark if you're Steel type you don't think you can cover the stored power sets. Edgequake, check. These are almost impossible to find, so I'm gonna say nice to have, not needed, but if you do have them, great, fantastic. Bits are borderline necessary. I think it's impossible to call them necessary, but Draft League player do indeed click a U-turn, and getting in your threats is obviously very crucial on any build. I don't even think this is just balance, just hyper offense, just stall. I think any build really appreciates pivots. And then lastly, I'm going to do ghost resistant immunity because I'm not really sure how to tier offensive and defensive terror or what exactly it means. The ghost resistor immunity is going to be borderline necessary. It goes hand in hand with the dark type. The dark is going to be there for stored power primarily, but it is going to also be a ghost resist. Ghost resistor immunity is going to also be a normal type. They're hard to come by this generation, but with how good the ghost types that are allowed are, we're talking Dragapult, we're talking Spectrier, even something like Ceruledge can give you a hard time if you do not have ghost resist or immunity, so I think it is borderline necessary. So that is going to be the tier list, guys. Let me know what you guys think down below. For those of you that skipped forward to the end, first of all, be sure to subscribe for causing me mental distress, but second of all, this is supposed to say regular ground instead of top tier ground, and this is supposed to say non-unaware wall instead of unaware wall, which is very ironic looking at it now because it literally just says unaware vowel. So unaware vowel, I don't know. That's gonna be it for this video, guys. If you want to tier your own, be sure to check it out down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and for now, guys, this has been John Jr. signing off.